In the West, most might have heard of the major Chinese subgroups: the Cantonese, the Shanghainese, the Sichuanese, the northern Beijing Mandarin speakers, perhaps even the Manchurians of northeast China. But there's one group that is arguably the most influential, wealthy, populous, and diasporic in the world that many foreigners outside of Asia might not be familiar with. Their worldwide population is estimated to be between 80 to 90 million, meaning if they possessed their own national identity, they'd number more than the entire population of Germany, Europe's second largest country. These are the Minnan speakers of Hoken, or Fujian in Mandarin.
The Minyue kingdom is unfit for humans. Its lands are covered with impenetrable mountain forests. The people there are covered in tattoos and have short hair. They worship snake gods, pull teeth, live in raised houses, and practice cliff burials. Their women rule the men, and they don't even know of animal husbandry.
This description of a kingdom in present-day Hokkien is a far stretch from the province of the present, which is the second wealthiest province per capita in China and one of the financial centers of the nation. Today, the Hokkien people are one of the most influential Chinese subgroups inside and out of China. But if we look back at the distant past, Fujian was far from anything recognizable as China. It was a land perceived as wild and untamed to the Chinese, perhaps something akin to how Germania was perceived by the Romans. So how did Fujian become one of the most important population centers in all of China and create one of the largest and most influential diasporas the world has ever known? Of this population, a disproportionate number make up many of the wealthiest individuals and families in the world. In terms of level of financial success according to native dialects spoken, Ming speakers are the highest earners per capita in China, behind only Beijing Mandarin speakers, which I mean, come on, is the dialect the national language is based off of. So it's impressive making the number 2 spot, even ranking ahead of other variations of Mandarin dialects. In fact, at one point in the 19th century, the richest man not only in China, but in the entire world, was a man of Hokkien descent. Who was this dude, and more importantly, who are the Hokkien? Well, let's talk about it, brah. I want to take a brief moment here to sincerely thank you guys for tuning in. This was just meant to be a fun passion project, and next thing you know, we about to hit 20,000 subscribers. And on top of the unexpected growth of this channel, I'm proud to shout out our first partner, locationsays. It's with their help that I'm able to create some of the incredible visuals and artwork in this video. Check out their TikTok channel where you'll find captivating videos about ancient Chinese culture created with AI, as well as content showcasing Chinese aesthetics in a unique visual style. You can also support them by visiting their Patreon, where you'll receive exclusive access to their experiences, creative workflows, and visual materials. Long before the Chinese began their southbound conquests, the indigenous people of southern China, known as the Yue to the Chinese, were masters of the open water, allowing them to create a diaspora throughout much of maritime Southeast Asia. It's perhaps uncoincidental then that the Hokkien, who would integrate and assimilate many of the native Yue people of Fujian into Chinese society, would later become the most prevalent diasporic Chinese subgroup. In the pre-imperial era over 2,000 years ago, Chinese civilization revolved entirely around the Yellow River Basin in northern China. Southern regions like the Kingdom of Linnan had yet to be Sinicized, and its populations were made up almost exclusively of non-Chinese Austroasiatic chiefdom groups, which shared overlapping characteristics with many Southeast Asian cultures. Fujian, however, was arguably one of the main meeting grounds of North meets South, where Chinese indigenous Southern Yue cultures collided. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that in later centuries in maritime Southeast Asia, Ming, the dominant local Chinese dialect of Fujian province, historically served as the lingua franca amongst overseas Chinese communities of all dialects and subgroups, and remains today as the most spoken variety of Chinese in the region, most notably in Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, Hainan, and Brunei. The region of Fujian was once home to the kingdom of Minyue, a contemporary of the Han Dynasty. It was founded by the royal family of Yue that fled south from modern-day Zhejiang and Jiangsu after being defeated by the kingdoms of Chu and Qi. It's from this royal family name that over time evolved the description of all southern, non-Chinese barbarians from present-day Jiangxi in the north to Vietnam in the south, which would be named Bai Yue, or 100 Yue, describing its great number of diverse ethnic groups and cultures. In fact, the word Yue, translated into Vietnamese, is Viet. Originally an exonym used by the Chinese, the word would develop into an endonym used by the Viet people to describe themselves. China enters into the imperial era under the leadership of Qing, China's first emperor. The kingdoms of the Yellow River Basin are for the first time unified under a single banner, laying the foundation of what many would consider the concept of what we call China today. In fact, the name China, that the majority of the Western world still uses today, comes from the Persian name for the Qing Dynasty, Qin. The emperor has over 500,000 imperial soldiers dispatched throughout Minyue to civilize the barbarians to the south. And Minyue's king is deposed, establishing a paramilitary Chinese government, which is aptly named the Minyue Commandery. And for the first time, the region of Fujian enters into China's direct political sphere of influence. After Qing death, the empire spirals into civil war, and the once centralized Qing government loses its grasp over the Yue kingdoms, and Wuzhu ascends as the king of a once again independent Minyue. Among many different options, the young king chooses to ally with the warlord Liu Bang, who is in the midst of fierce battle for control over China, and Wuzhu's gamble pays off as Liu defeats his adversaries and founds the Han Dynasty, which emerges as the successor to the Qing and the new superpower of East Asia. Minyue is allowed to preserve its independence as a tributary state to Han, with its capital situated in the fortified city of Fuzhou. Over the years following the footsteps of King Wuzhu, his successors developed the Minyue into the most powerful kingdom of Minyue through aggressive military expansion, and at its height, its boundaries encompassed territories of modern-day Fujian, Guangdong, Jiangxi, and Zhejiang. King Zhou Yushan ascends the throne as one of the most militaristic leaders in Minyue's history. Despite Han China's calls for peace between the southern Yue kingdoms, Zhou Yushan successfully expands Minyue's borders year after year. However, when the Han imperial court hears word of Minyue's mobilization of forces to invade the kingdom of Nanyue, what is modern-day Guangxi, Guangdong, and northern Vietnam, tensions reach a boiling point. The Han Dynasty launches a preemptive four-sided attack on its tributary state, 3 sides by land and 1 side by sea. Minyue prepares defenses at its major entry points, but they stand no match against the imperial army, and in 111 BC, before Han forces even reach Fuzhou, King Zhou Yushan is assassinated by his own kinsmen, who surrender the city to the emperor, ending over a century of independence, and Minyue lands are consolidated back under imperial rule. Fujian is one of the most geographically isolated regions in China, despite its close proximity to other major population centers, fostering the development of unique culture and language that differentiates itself from the rest of China. The province is known to the Chinese as 8 parts mountain, 1 part water, and 1 part farmland. It is the most forested region in all of China, and fittingly, also has the highest concentration in the world of people with the surname Ling, translated to wooded forest. Now under Han China control, Emperor Wu of Han felt it too troublesome to permanently occupy Minyue due to its extensive narrow mountain passes and thick forests. He commands the army to evict the region and resettle the population between the Yangtze and the Huai River. Legend has it that this left the region a deserted land, though in reality, this was almost certainly an impossible feat, and both Chinese and Austroasiatic populations continued to be present in Fujian during this era. After 4 centuries of dominance over Asia, the Han Dynasty collapses and China enters into the greatly romanticized Three Kingdoms period, which is comprised of Cao Wei, Su Han, and Eastern Wu, the latter being the rulers of modern-day Fujian. While most of our story focuses on the Han Chinese story of Fujian, it's important to note that a number of major Neolithic Austroasiatic speaking populations exist in Fujian prior to and during the arrival of the Chinese. These groups often develop into powerful tribal kingdoms and possess distinct cultures and heritage. For example, the Niubi-san and Hulu-san cultures were inland populations that were highly distinct from their contemporary counterparts along the coastline of Fujian, where the Tansi-san cultures dominated. Because of Fujian's extensive coastline, the areas adjacent to it were the earliest to be settled by the Chinese, who valued the lands as vital gateways for maritime trade and military operations, while the forested interiors were more successful in preserving indigenous cultures. In fact, many population centers in the interiors of the province continued to predominantly speak Austroasiatic languages until as late as the 8th century. Under the rule of Sun Quan, the founder of the Kingdom of Wu, the Sinicization of Fujian greatly intensified, as the kingdom spent 2 decades conquering much of the mountain-dwelling Sanyue people, many of whom were ultimately displaced, killed, or integrated into Chinese society. The Qing Dynasty's capital of Chang'an falls after succumbing to the will of semi-nomadic northern steppe peoples, known as the upheaval of the 5 barbarians. To escape violence and famine, 8 central China families flee south: Ten, Ling, Huang, Zheng, Zhan, Qiu, He, and Hu. To this day, the first 4 remain the most popular surnames in Fujian. This was the first case in history of a wave of mass immigration that included populations from the upper and noble classes, where prior to this, Chinese migrants to Fujian were predominantly soldiers, prisoners, peasants, and political exiles. This vastly changed the cultural landscape of the region, introducing Chinese art, science, technology, and urban planning like never before, transforming Fujian from a militaristic frontierland to a region of political and cultural significance. With the rise of the Tang Dynasty, considered one of the zeniths of Chinese high culture and dominance over Asia, the empire spans from the Korean peninsula in the east to the edge of Siberia and the steppes of Mongolia in the north, to present-day Afghanistan in the west, and to northern Vietnam in the south, and was almost certainly the most powerful and wealthy nation in the world during its era. The Tang Dynasty's powerfully centralized government ushered in an unprecedented level of peace and stability throughout the empire. This fostered further acceleration of Chinese migration to new frontiers like Fujian for those in search of new opportunities, significantly increasing the Chinese population, which was finally beginning to rival that of the indigenous Yue population. Southern Chinese dialects, including the Ming language family, often preserve more Old Chinese pronunciations and vocabulary relative to Mandarin, which was heavily influenced by far north steppe cultures like the Mongols, Manchus, and Xiongnu. However, while the Yue languages like Cantonese preserve a significant amount of Tang-era Chinese, Ming languages show traces of ancient pre-Tang phonology, while Cantonese generally does not, suggesting that Fujian saw greater large-scale migrations of Sinitic populations prior to that of more southern regions, which would make sense since Fujian sits geographically closer to the historical origins of Chinese culture around the Yellow River Basin. From a linguistic history perspective, Ming is even more unique in that it diverged from Old Chinese on a separate branch from Middle Chinese due to its geographic isolation, where most other major dialects today branch from Middle Chinese. However, because the Ming culture existed as a contemporary alongside more powerful Chinese kingdoms that spoke Middle Chinese, the Ming languages were heavily influenced by Middle Chinese despite not branching from it. A major contributor to this is thanks to Fujian's abnormally mountainous terrain, which acted as a natural barrier, fostering the development of more distinct culture and language, despite the region's close proximity to other major population centers. An unexpected rebellion is ignited by a half-Sogdian, half-Gokturk commander named Anlu San. A seasoned warrior with many successful campaigns against the Manchurians, he captures the eastern capital of the empire, Luoyang, and proclaims himself emperor, while Tang would recover some of its glory over the decades and revive itself as the later Tang Dynasty, following the assassination of Anlu San. His war would be the inspiration for several more significant rebellions against the Tang that would ultimately lead to the dynasty's collapse in 936 AD. The main belligerents to defeat later Tang were the Sinicized Turks of Sator and the Khitans of the Liao dynasty, both of which were considered semi-barbaric peoples to the Chinese. Again, like the upheaval of the 5 barbarians from the 4th century, the migration of hundreds of thousands of refugees is sparked by the overthrow of a Chinese dynasty by semi-nomadic peoples. We're starting to see a theme here and paint a picture as to why the Chinese were so hell-bent on constructing this wall from so many millennia ago.
Hey, what the hell you doing? Mongolian? Hey, fuck you, Mongolian! Don't you break down my wall!
Many of these refugees would end up in Fujian, once again reshaping the demographics of the region. This time not only increasing the number of Chinese relative to the indigenous Yue, but also birthing new distinct Chinese subgroups, because Chinese migrants that arrived in earlier waves would adopt some local Yue culture into their own, especially in earlier centuries when most migrants were single males that took on local Yue women as wives. As new waves of populations flee south, the new migrants would adopt some aspects of divergent southern Chinese culture and language, but would simultaneously introduce more recent northern culture to the local populations that had already existed in southern China for generations. Distinct southern China subgroups like the Hakka and Teochew would begin developing based on region of settlement and time of arrival into the south. During the Song Dynasty, the area is reorganized into the Fujian circuit, which is, for the first time in recorded history, that the name Fujian is used. The name originates from the combination of the two major city names of Fuzhou and Jianzhou, which would later be renamed Nanping. It's during this era that new Chinese seafaring technologies like watertight bulkheads and improved compasses allow for greater numbers of Chinese merchants and explorers to travel to distances previously unimagined, and Fuzhou would become the center for shipbuilding and maritime trade in all of China, laying the early foundation for the development of the overseas Hoken diaspora. One of the first regions to be settled is the Red River Delta in modern-day Vietnam, and it's not a coincidence that at this time, the most common surname during the Li and Tran dynasties of Vietnam was Tran, which translates to Chen in Chinese, the most common surname in Fujian. Today, Tran still persists as the second most popular surname in Vietnam. Great numbers of Hokkien migrants would settle the region, assimilating into Viet communities, while simultaneously influencing the local culture, even creating their own aptly named Tran Port, a vital seaport that accelerated the Sinicization and urbanization of Vietnam. China once again reaches one of the zenith points in its history in terms of power, wealth, and stability during the early Ming Dynasty. The empire begins diverting an enormous amount of resources towards maritime exploration to expand trade lanes and acquire new tributary states, most exemplified by Zheng He and his treasure voyages, which at its height visited cities throughout Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Arabian Peninsula, and even East Africa. With 317 ships and 28,000 crewmen, Zhen's campaigns were regarded as the greatest naval expedition in human history up to that point. With these newly developed trade lanes, Fujian becomes increasingly involved in maritime trade, particularly with Southeast Asia. Ships departing from Fujian are mostly stocked with porcelain, silk, and tea, and would return with valuable foreign commodities like spices, wood, and silver. This maritime trade leads to the establishment of Hokkien merchant communities in various Southeast Asian regions, a trend that laid further groundwork for the significant Hokkien diaspora in later centuries. Fujian is finally upgraded to its own province, with its capital situated in the ancient city of Fuzhou, which would become the primary staging area and supply depot of Zheng He's naval expeditions. The Ming Chinese dialect becomes increasingly more influential abroad and begins showing up in the languages it has contact with, such as Thai, Kelantan of Malaysia, and Hokaglish of the Philippines, acting as a base lexifier, indicating that it often existed as the dominant or super straight language in each region, contributing loanwords to the local languages. The word Minnan, a subdialect within the Ming umbrella family, describes the dominant language, culture, and sub-ethnic Han Chinese group of Fujian and translates to south of Ming, referencing the region south of the Ming River in northern Fujian. This translation is quite literal, in that within Ningde and Nanping prefectures, the regions north of the river at the edge of Zhejiang province, many local people speak Tuqiwu, a subdialect group of the Wu language family that is indigenous to Shanghai, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, Anhui, and Jiangxi provinces in central China, differentiating them from the Minnan subgroups that are south of the Ming River. This is comparable to the Teochew of Guangdong, who reside at the northern edge of the province, but speak a Ming dialect, differentiating themselves from the rest of the Cantonese-speaking population. During the transition from Ming to Qing rule, Fujian, like other parts of southern China, experiences serious political unrest. Many northern Ming loyalists would flee to Fujian, one of the last holdouts against the southbound Manchu Qing forces. One of the most noteworthy Ming loyalists was Zheng Cengong, a half Hokkien, half Japanese general, who was one of the Qing Dynasty's greatest obstacles in completing their conquest of China. Zheng sets up successful defenses in Fujian and even pushes northward, attacking the fallen capital of Nanjing, but fails to take the city. Facing imminent defeat on the mainland, Zheng flees to the Dutch-controlled island of Taiwan and expels the Europeans. Setting up a base camp there for Ming refugees, and founds the kingdom of Dongning. Although the Dutch presence on the island had historically already drawn in numbers of Hokkien peasant workers, Zheng's occupation of Taiwan sparks large-scale Chinese migration, including a significant population of Ming upper-class society, transforming the political and cultural landscape of the island. The majority of the migrants depart from Fuzhou and Quanzhou, and until the present day, over 70% of the island is ethnically of Hokkien descent, and approximately the same percentage are able to at least understand, if not speak at an intermediate to advanced level, despite the national language being Mandarin. In 1683 AD, the Qing Dynasty mobilizes 21,000 men and 240 warships to meet the Dongning Navy at the Pescadores Islands. Outnumbered 3-1, Dongning forces are decimated, and Taiwan is formally annexed as a prefecture under Fujian province governance. Under Qing rule, hundreds of thousands of Chinese migrants moved to the island in search of land and opportunity, with the vast majority hailing from Fujian. Hainan Island also sees an influx in Hokkien migrants during this era, but unlike Taiwan, which sits adjacent to Fujian, the closest province to the island, Hainan is nearly 1,500 kilometers or 1,000 miles away from Fuzhou and sits directly south of Guangxi and Guangdong provinces. And yet, curiously, while there are pockets of Cantonese-speaking communities throughout the island, the dominant local dialect, Hainanese, falls under the Ming language family, as opposed to the Yue language family, the dominant local dialect of Guangxi and Guangdong. This is a testament to the enormous scale of the historical migration patterns of the people of Fujian, and emphasizes just how diasporic the Hokkien were in their expansion through maritime East and Southeast Asia. In addition, this fact could lend credence to the notion that the lingua franca of trade, finance, and academia in Southeast Asia was Hokkien, which meant that even if you were of Cantonese descent, it was often a necessity to learn Hokkien in order to conduct business in Hainan. During the High Qing era, the dynasty is the largest economy in the world and rules over 1/3 of the world's population. Fujian sees tremendous economic growth and is known globally for its production of high-quality porcelain, sugar, ships, and perhaps most famously, tea.
Would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a cup of tea? Go on, have a cup of tea.
Thank you very much.
I want you to have a cup of tea. Because I have nothing to say about this matter except to offer you some tea.
In fact, the inspiration for the English word tea comes from Dutch traders who most likely learned of the Minnan word te directly from Hokkien traders in Xiamen, Quanzhou, or Taiwan, or possibly indirectly in Southeast Asia through the Malay loanword te. In contrast, cultures like the Portuguese, Indians, and Persians that learned of tea from Cantonese or Mandarin speakers refer to it as some variation of the word cha. In the later Qing period, China would enter into the era known as the Century of Humiliation. Government corruption and inability to adapt to the modern world leads to military losses to Japan and European nations, civil war, and economic stagnation. Hundreds of thousands of Hokkien flee violence and famine for maritime Southeast Asia, solidifying the Hokkien diaspora that we know today. However, despite the difficult circumstances in mainland China, there were those that still capitalized on opportunities with the West. Wu Bingjian, known in the West as Hao Kwa, is a Hokkien man in Canton with ancestry from Quanzhou. He is a merchant in the 13 factories, head of the Yiwo Hong, and leader of the Canton Kohong, and rises to become the richest man in the world. He accumulates his wealth through facilitating trade between China and the British Empire during the First Opium War, and is one of the few Chinese authorized to trade silk and porcelain with foreigners, effectively allowing him to monopolize business with the West, which is largely confined to the city of Canton. He grows so wealthy that of the $3 million the Qing government is required to pay as restitution to the British Crown following the Opium War, Hao Qua single-handedly contributes $1 million from his own coffers. The number of notable influential people of Hoken descent inside and out of China are too numerous to fit into this video. From academia to politics to business, the Hokkien have disproportionately dominated various fields and have influenced the world in immeasurable ways. From dynastic Vietnam monarchs to Philippines presidents to Malaysia prime ministers, countless heads of states and nations outside of China have roots from Fujian. The two nations that exist today that are composed predominantly of populations with Hokkien ancestry are Taiwan and Singapore, both of which rank extremely high on the Human Development Index and GDP per capita lists, making them two of the most desirable places in the world to live and do business. Taiwan consistently ranks as the freest country in Asia, and Singapore consistently ranks as the best country in the world for business. Although the story of each Hokkien billionaire is deserving of its own video in itself, the list is far too extensive to fit into just one, so I'll just mention two of arguably the most influential individuals of the 21st century. Jensen Huang of Taiwan, through his position as the CEO and co-founder of Nvidia, has racked in an estimated net worth of $130 billion.
AI,
and broke into the top 10 richest people in the world in 2024, earning him the number 9 spot on Forbes' billionaires list. He is the richest person of Asian descent in the world, and as of the time of making this video, his company, Nvidia, has the second largest market cap in the world, ahead of Microsoft and behind only Apple, though many economists project that Nvidia may overtake Apple as the number 1 spot in the coming years. He can understand and speak Minnan through his Taiwanese roots on his mother's side. Another less wealthy but equally industry-shaping individual is Zhang Yiming. Born in Fujian, he created Douyin, which is internationally better known as TikTok. With an estimated net worth of $45 billion, Time magazine named him one of 2019's top 100 most influential people in the world. Fujian province itself has struggled in the last 2 centuries relative to its long history. Its decline relative to other coastal provinces like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Guangdong began during the late Qing Dynasty, when the government placed bans and restrictions on foreign trade, leading to a rise in piracy and the disruption of arguably the most lucrative trade coast in the world during the Middle Ages. Then, following the rise of the People's Republic of China through the late 20th century, Fujian's coastal cities received less federal and private investment due to fears of military conflict because of its close proximity to Taiwan's Republic of China and the US military presence patrolling the Taiwan Strait. However, in recent decades, Fujian's economy has grown exponentially, with the cities of Fuzhou, Quanzhou, and Xiamen leading the way in expanding its manufacturing and service sectors, making Fujian the second highest income per capita province at $18,500 per year, behind only Jiangsu. But given its incredible and storied legacy domestically and abroad, is it any wonder that we would see the Hokkien rise up to once again influence the world? If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It makes a huge difference in allowing me to create more content like this.